remember when I was in high school going to this church camp called Experience the Valley. And I remember sitting in this grass field. It was about halfway through the week, and we had a very traumatizing event take place. One of the leaders on stage was explaining what had happened, and he's explaining that one of the students in my youth group had drowned. And I remember crying and crying and crying. I remember the whole picture of where I sat and the relation of everything else to me, and even some of the locations of key people around me. I remember all of it, this awful, awful tragedy. I cried for hours and hours and hours so hard that I felt like my nose was going to pop off, and I felt just so dehydrated at the end of it all. It was awful. My head was just on fire from crying. It's the hardest I've ever cried. I remember this tragedy. I also remember a slightly less serious tragedy in high school. Well, it didn't seem less serious at the time, but there was this girl in my friend group. I'd wanted to date her for like a year. She's like my dream girl, and I finally get the chance to date her. And a couple weeks into dating her, we're in the auditorium. I still remember exactly where it was that she says this to me. And there's a couple other people around. We're not even like by ourselves. And she says to me, she says, "I just don't think I can date you anymore because of what people are saying about you." I'm like, what are people saying about me, Well, later I found out this is another tragedy that happened. I remember it was in the morning and I had to be at school at 6:30 for jazz band. And I remember walking out to my car to find that the whole thing was covered in maple syrup, that it was just totally vandalized by people. And this is what my girlfriend had hinted at, that there were being rumors spread about me because of my Christian convictions, because of beliefs that I had expressed about certain ethical issues regarding Christianity. I was very heavily persecuted for it in high school. And it was rough. And I look back on these tragedies. I have to be honest, in the moment they were hard. And I think that's been conveyed. That like in the moment I cried super hard. It was just so serious. Now that I'm past it, right, I have a beautiful wife named Bree that I've married, definitely married up for sure. And this awesome lady that I get to live the rest of my life with. Even looking back on this time that I was dumped by a girl I dated for 2 weeks, there's still pain there. There's still tragedy there. It's still hard. And this is one of the traits of tragedy, is that in the moment, yeah, it's like pure bad. It's really hard. And after it, that doesn't leave. That you'll always carry some of that with you. But there'll be good that comes from it, and I think specifically of my wife. Now, the scripture that we're talking about, I want to dive a little deeper into, which is Romans 8:28. Just a reminder, it says, "And we know that those who love God, all things are worked together for good, for those who are called according to His will." There's actually a fairly significant textual variant going on here. I'm going to try to explain this as simply as I can. There's basically two different groups of manuscripts that say different things. One of the groups is a large group. It's many different manuscripts. It carries a little more weight, and it has a reading in this text that is a little bit vague that can be taken two different ways. The two different ways being this part that says, all things are worked into good is one of the readings, or you could say that God works all things for good. Now, another grouping, it's smaller, but there's some good manuscripts in this grouping, actually specify that it's the latter. It's God works all things for good. And so it doesn't really matter which of these positions you take. Either way, it's God. And I think this is key here, that despite there being different schools of thought, whether you think that it's God who is intricately in every single little thing sticking His hands into the bad and forming it into good, or whether you believe that it's part of the world that God created, that everything that's bad, for those who love Him, there's no choice but it to turn to good. Regardless of which of those you believe, it's God who causes the miracle. It's God who makes bad good. It's God who is on the throne. It's God who is sovereign. Let's look at a specific example from the Bible of tragedy. Now, I think the biggest tragedy that we see in the Bible is the crucifixion, is Jesus' death on the cross. And when we look at the specific language that the authors of the Gospels use, we'll look here in Matthew chapter 27, verse 27. The title of this is "The Soldiers Mock Jesus." You probably have heard of this section where it talks about the lashing and the humiliation and the things that the crowd chanted even. We look at this and we see one word repeated many, many times in this text. and it's the word and. It's a very common word. But you might be able to understand why someone would use common language to describe a very tragic situation. I'll give you an example. Let's say that my dog passed away, and I'm just really struggling with my dog's passing, but I'm trying to tell you what happened. I might say it like this. I might go, and my dog just wasn't feeling well, and my dog's legs were numb and cold, and I took my dog to the vet, and the vet told me my dog had a blood clot, and we put my dog down, and I was really sad. And you see, the way I simplify my language is a way of dealing with the grief of the tragedy. And so when we look at the cross, when we look at this thing that's happened, this tragedy, this difficult, hard thing, we see a man wrongly accused of something he didn't do, who died. He was sinless. He wasn't only someone who didn't do bad, he was someone that did all the good. And wrongfully accused was given scoundrel's death on the cross. And I think about how that cross, of course not as ornately made as this, but how that cross was for me. That cross, I deserved it. And we look at the language that the authors of the Gospels used, and it makes sense. They were struggling with this. This was hard. And in the moment, you got to empathize with them. Their leader just died. Their leader was just crucified. And they have no idea what they're going to do. They've given him their life. But 3 days later, he rose. And we just had Easter Sunday. And this is the truth that is so perfectly conveyed by the crucifixion. Though it's bad, right? The fact that Jesus was crucified, it's bad. It's also good. When we look back, we get to have relationship with God because of this. We get to have communion with him because of this tragedy. And so as Christians, we have this confidence that in every situation we have duality of mind. We get to experience the tragedy, and it's going to be hard, it's going to be bad, it's going to be difficult. But in that bad, things are worked for good. And in this season, we're talking about coronavirus, and this is really the decision we decided to talk about, Turn to Good, as a lesson series. Things are bad right now, and we're not saying God made the bad things happen. We're not saying that you have to think everything is good. We're not saying that you need to reject the fact that you are probably struggling right now. But what we are saying is that have hope. Take confidence in the fact that we serve a God who turns bad to good. We serve a God that is capable of that.